If you're taking the LSAT, you should know that the LSAT test format has recently changed. LSAC removed the logic game section and replaced it with a second scored logical reasoning section. Today, I'll walk through the recent changes, the reasons behind them, and what they mean for your LSAT prep going forward. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, ever since the June 1991 LSAT, the LSAT format was consistent with logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comp. There were some changes here and there, most recently due to the LSAT Flex format introduced at the beginning of the pandemic, and then more recently when they added back in the unscored extra experimental section. But overall, the test questions remained largely the same: logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comp. However, due to a lawsuit from blind test takers who contended they were at an unfair disadvantage because they couldn't benefit from diagramming the way other test takers could, LSAC agreed to change the test format for everybody by developing a new version of the test without the then current logic games section. LSAC experimented with a couple of substitution questions to replace logic games, and they tested these out in a field study in December 2022, for example. They tested them out here and there on unscored extra sections for other test takers, but ultimately they decided to simply remove the logic games section entirely and replace it with a second scored logical reasoning section. And they announced they were not making any big radical changes to the test other than the removal of the logic games section, meaning they were not going to add in some new bizarre type of LSAT question. Great news for me, great news for everyone, and no need to study anything additional. In fact, for the average test taker, all you've got to do is spend more time on logical reasoning than you otherwise would have. This is great because it's less material for you to study. You can narrow your focus on logical reasoning, since any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across the two sections. However, we did see early indications going as far back as November 2023 that LSAC was making some unannounced subtle changes to the test. Specifically, since last November, we saw in the unscored extra sections that LSAC is including an increased proportion of questions involving formal logic, conditional reasoning, quantitative reasoning in the logical reasoning experimental sections. What this means is that LSAC may be looking to test out these concepts in logical reasoning, since they can no longer test them in the logic game section, which is what they used to do. LSAC has done this quite consistently for every single LSAT administration, going back since at least November 2023, if not earlier. And on recent official scored LSAT sections, we have also seen more questions involving conditional reasoning, formal logic, testing out your understanding of numbers and percentages. And so what this means is that if you're taking the LSAT going forward, you're going to want to devote a bit more time to these types of questions than you otherwise would have. Again, LSAC is not radically changing the test. This is a slow evolution where they are increasing the relative proportion of questions testing this type of logic. And so if you're studying from recently administered prep tests, which I hope you are, you should be aware that you may want to devote a bit more time to those specific types of questions than you otherwise would. This will include inference questions, this will include parallel reasoning questions, this will include sufficient assumption questions, and maybe even some flaw questions as well. The three most common types of questions you'll see on LSAT logical reasoning are inference, flaw, and necessary assumption. And so 2 out of those 3, inference and flaw, may become even a bit more common in their relative proportion, and maybe the prevalence of necessary assumption questions will decrease a little bit, since these questions do not involve that kind of formal logic or conditional reasoning. So in order to properly address the question of what happened to the logic game section, while technically LSAC has removed this section, we are likely to see the evolution of logical reasoning into being something closer to logic games than it was in the past. Of course, we're still going to expect to see roughly 25, 26 questions on a wide variety of question types, including inference, strengthen, weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and so on. But we may see more question types like those I mentioned, inference, flaw, and sufficient assumption, maybe a few more parallel, and we will likely see more questions involving conditional reasoning, conditional logic, testing your understanding of necessary and sufficient conditions, your ability to form conditional chains, link things together, diagramming and such may still be useful, despite the reasons for that lawsuit that initially removed logic games from the test for everyone. Now, if you'd like my help on your journey to scoring a 170 or above on the LSAT whenever you're taking it, there are a wide variety of ways that could support you. You can check out the links below to find out more. And to book a call with me and my team, we'd be glad to help you out. We offer live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching. And if you're curious for some examples of the types of questions I'm talking about, again, these have appeared on the LSAT going back decades. It's not something totally new, but we may see a bit more of it than we did in the past. So for example, if we were to take prep test 30, for example, going back 25 years or so, there was an inference question, a must be true question specifically about inspired musical performances. You can Google that one if you want to practice it. There was also a question on prep test 44, or a flaw question testing your understanding of numbers and percentages involving Clara Schumann, who plays the piano. In prep test 53, there was a parallel reasoning question involving April rainfall, where diagramming would have been useful. And in prep test 58, there was a sufficient assumption question involving handmade wigs. Again, any of these 4 questions, you can Google them if you want to find the prep test in the new numbering format, if that's what you're using prep test 101 to 158, rather than the old format prep test numbered from 1 to 94. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.